On May 31st, 1889, a wall of water taller than a four-story building rushed toward a small American town at nearly 40 miles per hour. Families were eating dinner, children were playing outside. No one had more than 10 minutes to escape. By the time the water stopped moving, over 2,200 people were dead. Yet today, almost nobody talks about this disaster. This is the forgotten story of the Johnstown flood. Johnstown, Pennsylvania was a hard-working steel town tucked inside a narrow valley, built along the banks of the Little Conemaugh River. Life revolved around the massive Cambria Iron Works, a symbol of America's industrial might. Thousands of families, many of them recent immigrants seeking a better life, depended on the mills for their survival. It was a town built on grit and sweat, a community forged in fire and steel. They were proud of their town, proud of their work, and felt secure in their little valley. But perched 14 miles upriver, looming over them, was a ticking time bomb. The South Fork Dam. It held back a massive man-made lake called Lake Conemaugh. The dam was originally built back in the 1840s to supply water for a now obsolete canal system. When the railroads made the canals pointless, the dam and the lake fell into disrepair. For years it sat there, neglected. Then, in 1879, it was sold to a group of wealthy businessmen from Pittsburgh, including industrial titans like Andrew Carnegie and Henry Clay Frick. They didn't see an aging piece of infrastructure. They saw a perfect location for an exclusive summer retreat. They formed the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club and transformed the lake into a private paradise. For the country-s elite, they built lavish cottages, a grand clubhouse, and stocked the lake for boating and fishing. To make their resort more convenient, they made a series of changes to the old dam. They lowered its height to widen the road across the top, making it easier for their carriages to pass. They removed the original discharge pipes at the bottom of the dam, which could have been used to drain the lake in an emergency, and sold them for scrap metal. They installed a fish screen across the spillway, the emergency channel designed to let excess water escape safely. This screen was meant to keep their expensive game fish from escaping, but it also caught logs, branches, and other debris, effectively clogging the dam's only safety valve. Each of these modifications, done in the name of comfort and leisure, quietly but critically weakened the structure. But the club members weren't engineers, they were vacationers. And down in the valley, the people of Johnstown had no idea the danger that was growing above them, day by day. They trusted that the men who owned the dam, the most powerful men in the country, knew what they were doing. It was a trust that would prove to be tragically misplaced. The last week of May in 1889 brought a storm of biblical proportions. It was the worst downpour anyone in western Pennsylvania could remember. The rain was relentless, turning creeks into torrents and rivers into raging rapids. For days, it just didn't stop. The mountainsides became saturated, pouring runoff into every tributary that fed Lake Conemaugh. The water level in the lake began to rise at an alarming rate, more than a foot every hour. Up at the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club, the handful of staff and members present grew frantic. The club's president, Elias Unger, realized the immense danger. He gathered a small crew of workmen, and they rushed to the dam. They tried desperately to dig a new channel to relieve the pressure, but their shovels were useless against the rising tide. They tried to clear the debris that was choking the spillway, but the force of the water was too great. The fish screen was completely blocked. Water started seeping through the earthen walls of the dam, then pouring over the top in small waterfalls. Unger knew the dam was doomed. He sent a man on horseback galloping down the mountain to the nearest telegraph station with a desperate warning for the people of Johnstown. Warnings were telegraphed to towns downstream. A message reached Johnstown, but it was vague and unclear. Worse, the town had heard false alarms about the dam breaking before. Most people dismissed the warning, assuming it was just another case of crying wolf. The telegraph lines, battered by the storm, soon went dead. Johnstown was cut off from the outside world, completely unaware of the cataclysm about to be unleashed. At 3:10 p.m. on that dreary Friday afternoon, the dam finally surrendered. With a low, terrifying rumble that witnesses said sounded like thunder, the center of the South Fork Dam simply disintegrated. What happened next was unimaginable. 20 million tons of water, the entire weight of Lake Conemaugh, exploded down the narrow valley. This wasn't just a flood, It was an inland tsunami, a wave estimated to be nearly 70 feet high in some places. It moved at 40 miles per hour. Carrying with it the force of Niagara Falls, it hit the small village of South Fork first, obliterating it in seconds. Then it roared on, picking up everything in its path. Trees, rocks, houses, barns, railroad tracks, and livestock were all swept into a churning, monstrous wall of debris. The water slammed into a railroad viaduct, which held for a few minutes before shattering, adding hundreds of tons of stone and steel to the deadly mixture. Barbed wire from a factory was torn from its spools, creating invisible snares within the torrent that would trap and entangle victims. When the wave hit Johnstown, it was a moving mountain of wreckage. Entire houses were lifted from their foundations and smashed into splinters. Heavy locomotives were tossed hundreds of feet like toys. People were sucked from their homes, trapped inside collapsing buildings, or crushed by the debris.
Oh.
The whole disaster unfolded in less than 10 minutes. In those 10 minutes, the town of Johnstown was wiped from the face of the earth. But the horror wasn't over. The immense pile of wreckage, a tangled mess of buildings, trees, train cars, and human bodies slammed into the town's sturdy stone bridge and got stuck. It's created a new 30-acre dam right in the middle of what was once Johnstown, and then it caught fire. Oil from overturned lamps and coal from stoves ignited the dry timber. Survivors who had clung to floating wreckage found themselves trapped in a rising flood with a blazing inferno bearing down on them. People trapped in the debris pile were burned alive while the floodwaters continued to rise around them. It was a scene straight from hell. As the water finally receded, the true scale of the devastation became clear. Johnstown was gone. Where a bustling town of 30,000 people had stood just hours before, there was now a silent, muddy wasteland piled high with wreckage. The aftermath was a landscape of profound grief and shock. Over 2,200 people were dead. That's more fatalities than in the San Francisco earthquake of 1906, or the attack on Pearl Harbor, or even the sinking of the Titanic 2 decades later. Entire families were wiped out. Hundreds of children were orphaned. For weeks, rescue parties searched the mud and debris for survivors and bodies. Some victims were found as far away as Cincinnati, over 350 miles downriver. Nearly 1,000 victims were never identified and were buried in a mass grave. News of the disaster horrified the nation and the world. Donations poured in. In a landmark moment for humanitarian aid, Clara Barton, the founder of the American Red Cross, arrived to lead one of the first and largest disaster relief efforts in the country's history. For 5 months, she and her volunteers provided food, shelter, and medical care, setting a new standard for how a nation responds to tragedy. But here's the most shocking part of the story. Despite the clear evidence of negligence, the modifications to the dam, the blocked spillway, the ignored warnings, no one was ever held legally responsible for the disaster. The South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club's wealthy members hired the best lawyers. Their defense was that the flood was an act of God, an unforeseeable natural disaster that no one could have prevented. The courts agreed. The club and its members were exonerated of all blame. They'd never paid a cent to the victims or their families, and so the tragedy that they had caused was slowly allowed to fade from public memory. Why does a flood from over a century ago still matter today? The Johnstown flood was a brutal, horrifying lesson for America. It forced the country to fundamentally rethink its laws regarding dam safety and corporate responsibility. It led to new engineering standards and a recognition that private interests cannot be allowed to endanger public lives. The disaster showed the world what happens when profit and pleasure are placed above the safety of ordinary people. The story of Johnstown isn't just about a broken dam. It's about a broken system of justice. It's a powerful reminder of how quickly the world we know can be swept away, and how the pursuit of luxury for a few can lead to unimaginable tragedy for the many. Because sometimes the most important lessons from history are hidden in the disasters we choose to forget. If you find forgotten history stories like this one fascinating, make sure to subscribe for more weekly documentaries. We dig deep into the events that shaped our world but have been lost to time. Let us know in the comments below. Had you ever heard of the Johnstown flood before watching this? Thanks for watching.